Hey class, it's Bob Durst, and we're going to continue our discussion on human biology. In this chapter and section, we are going to focus on conservation on a global scale. If we look at the global population growth, it's exponentially increasing right now. Hopefully, the global population growth will peter off or level off soon. Currently, there are over 7 billion people on the planet. We're adding about 80 million people a year. That is quite a few people being added to the planet. If we look at where these people are being added to the planet, most individuals are being added to the planet right now in developing countries. Most developed countries have stable populations. They aren't really growing or shrinking. They're just maintaining the status quo. Now, if we look at how we measure populations, we're going to look at growth rate. Growth rate is the number of births minus the number of deaths that occur each year. So, for example, if we looked at a population of 10 people, and within that population of 10 people, I had 10 people, or I had 2 births and 1 death. The growth rate would be 1, or 10% annually. Now, if we look at the biotic potential of our planet, we find that maximum growth rate is going to be limited by the ideal conditions that aren't going to be obtained in the environment. For example, if we took one E. coli bacterium and exposed it to ideal conditions for a couple weeks, that the mass of the E. coli that would be grown from a result of that would be greater than the planet. So we need to have some environmental factors limit environmental growth. We as human beings are really good at altering our environmental factors to artificially inflate our biotic potential. The carrying capacity is typically going to be called is the point at what growth is no longer going to be able to be sustained by the environment. Depending on the standard of living, we have passed the carrying capacity, or that's if we have a high standard of living, so lots of toys, lots of computers, lots of space, 3 cars in our garage, so on and so forth. If we have a very low standard of living in dirt floor huts, we would have a much higher carrying capacity on our planet. So, in less developed countries, we see that the population has been growing very rapidly. And in developed countries, the population experienced a sharp growth, but now it's kind of stagnating or slowing down or decreasing. If we can curb the growth rate, the world's population is predicted to, how can I say this, level off at 9 billion people. If we don't curb the growth rate on our planet, the world's population is predicted to continue with that exponential growth. When we look at mean growth rates, we typically find that in the United States, we have less than 1% of an increase in our population per year. And these are going to be in more developed countries. As an average, a more developed country has an average growth of 0.1% per year. A less developed country, an LDC, is going to have a growth rate that is going to be multiple percent per year. Back in the 1960s, that peaked at 2.5% growth per year. Since that time, the growth rate has slowed down in less developed countries. If we look at very undeveloped countries, or the most less developed countries, they're going to have the highest growth rate because there's the most easy room for improvement. Even though our world's growth rate has slowed down, the growth rate is still going to be increased. The population is still increasing. It's just increasing at a slower rate. We find that we are having more individuals in our population, and more women in particular, entering their reproductive years than leaving their reproductive years. What does this mean? There are more fertile women. The amount of fertile women on the planet is growing relative to the amount of infertile women on the planet. That means that we're still going to have sustained population growth. Not leveling, not plateauing, and not shrinkage on the planet. So let's look at a more developed country. In a more developed country, there's generally speaking going to be an even split or proportion in the population. We have an even spread of young people, reproductively aged adults, and then senior aged adults. In less developed countries, there is a huge influx of young people, a large proportion of the population that's reproductively viable, and then a very small segment of the population is going to be an elderly adult. One thing that is noticeable or notable within these less developed countries, and I should say also within the more developed countries as well, is particularly when you look at these geriatric years towards these end stage of life, we always will see a larger proportion of female compared to males in the populations. And this is both for the more developed countries and the less developed countries. So in other words, if you're a woman, you are more likely to live longer compared to the average male. Hey, that's kind of cool. So let's have a concept check, class. In the next several decades, global human population is expected to increase, remain the same, or decrease. Go ahead and pause this video, check your notes to get me an answer, or you can rewind it and then check the slides. Get me an answer right meow. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The human population is predicted to A, increase over the next several decades. Moving on to section 25.2, let's look at some of the resources that we have on our planet. We have renewable and non-renewable resources. Those are the two broad categories. Generally speaking, a non-renewable resource is one that cannot be replenished within a human lifetime. Now, arguably, fossil fuels are regenerating, but they're regenerating so slowly that it's not going to be at an appreciable rate or a usable rate of regeneration. The same is true for land. We generate about 1 inch of topsoil per century within the United States. And that's good. You know, it's great that we can regenerate our topsoil. The issue is we are losing topsoil much faster than 1 inch per century. Renewable resources can be effectively renewed or replenished within a usable time frame. And these are things like clean water, plants, we can regrow them, animals, they can reproduce. Generally speaking, these things can be replenished within less than 2 years. If we're looking at timber, maybe like less than a decade for trees. We find, generally speaking, that as a byproduct of human activities, we are going to have an increase in pollution. And when we look at pollution here, we define pollution loosely as something that harms the natural environment. So when we as humans have more activities or we consume more resources, generally speaking, we have more pollution or more harm caused to the environment. Let's look at the land resources we have. Beaches right now across the world are in danger. About half of the world's population lives within spitting distance of a coastline. And this is a big problem because right now the coastlines worldwide, particularly the ocean coastlines, are rapidly eroding. There's been slight increases in sea level over the last 50 years. And there's been a dramatic increase in the last 50 years in the prevalence of tropical storms, typhoons, and hurricanes that really accelerate the loss of these fragile shorelines. We also find that we're losing wetlands right now in many developed countries or developing countries. These wetlands are lost because they're being filled in for development, or they may be lost because we are rerouting rivers or rerouting dams and using them, or rerouting streams and using that water for a human purpose. It's a problem when we lose a wetland because those wetlands act like a giant natural sponge that can absorb a swelling of water and then slowly release that water as it's being filtered. Wetlands are also significantly important because they are used as breeding or spawning areas for both many marine organisms and then also particularly migratory birds rely on many wetlands. We also have semi-arid lands. You can think of these as an almost desert area. Semi-arid lands are areas that aren't quite a desert, but they're really, really dry areas. You could think of a good example, at least in the United States, of a semi-arid land, would be on the east side of the Cascade Mountains. So on the leeward side of the Cascade Mountains, there's going to be a juniper there's going to be an area that's very rich in juniper and it's very semi-arid and very dry. But then you drive over the mountain to the windward side and then you have the Cascade Rainforest. Well, if we look at these semi-arid lands, they are at risk right now of overgrazing and overuse. As we remove vegetation from that land, we are going to have soil be disturbed. We're going to have more airborne soil, and that area is being converted to desert. Within the sub-Saharan Africa plateau right now, we find that the Saharan desert is expanding dramatically south into Africa. It's consuming these semi-arid lands, which has led to an incentive known as the Green Wall, where there's an incentive right now, or a impetus or a push to plant a thick wall of locust trees along the border, southern border of the Sahara Desert. And these locust trees are great because they are legumes, they add nitrogen to the soil, they add organic matter to the soil, and they help to anchor the soil in place and slow down wind speeds to reduce the rate that sand is blowing around and spreading the desert. We also have tropical rainforests. Tropical rainforests are suffering right now from deforestation. Deforestation is when the forest is chopped down. Deforestation leads to very infertile agricultural grazing land. Generally speaking, in the rainforests, tropical rainforests in particular, the soil itself isn't that rich in nutrients. The vast majority of the nutrients are tied up in active biomass. So when somebody chops down a forest to plant a field in a tropical rainforest, they can only get a couple crop seasons out of that field before they need to chop down another forest or another section of the forest and just continue this cycle. Another big downside of chopping down a forest is you lose lots of organisms. It's a big loss of biodiversity. If we look at an overview from your text, you can see along the coastal shorelines of the United States, particularly in the Gulf and East Coast of the United States, most of the shoreline is under high threat of erosion. If we look at land globally, many areas of land are semi-arid lands and in danger of desertification. And if we look at the rainforest or the forested land in the world, the general trend is that there are slight increases in the amount of forest growth that is occurring within North America, Europe, and Northern Asia. But within South America, Africa, and Southern Asia, we're actually losing forested land. Another important renewable resource is water. Most of the water that's used, fresh water I should say, in the world that's used is going to be used for irrigation, or it's going to be used to grow crops. In the more developed countries, we also have a lot of excess water used for bathing, toilets, watering our lawns, drinking and cooking, so on and so forth. These are luxuries that many individuals in developing countries or less developed countries do not have. If we look at how we use this water, fresh water, within more developed countries, many times it's because we dam up a river and that changes the flow so that it can be rerouted and redistributed through a series of pumps, channels, and irrigation systems. The downside of using a dam to reroute a river is that it causes sediment to build up behind the dam, and this sediment will eventually choke out the reservoir. And another key feature is that the sediment no longer is heading downstream. The sediment oftentimes was a natural fertilizer, and when the river would periodically flood, that sediment would be distributed over the floodplain and would fertilize the floodplain. We also have aquifers that are being drained. You can think of an aquifer as groundwater, and there's both replenishable and fossil aquifers. The replenishable aquifers are near the surface. The fossil aquifers are deep down in the bedrock. And a fossil aquifer is going to be covered by an impermeable layer of bedrock, impermeable to water that is. We are draining our aquifers faster than they are being replenished. We are also tapping into fossil aquifers worldwide, and fossil aquifers cannot be replenished within an appreciable time frame. As we are removing more and more water from the ground, this has led to sinkhole formation and saltwater intrusion into the aquifers, particularly in coastal areas. I remember I spent some time in San Salvador, an island in the Bahamas. Not the city in Central America, San Salvador, the island in the Bahamas. And being a coral reef island, if you drilled down too deep into the aquifer, you wouldn't pull fresh water out of the ground. You would actually pull salt water out of the ground because there's lots of saltwater intrusion in those very low-lying Caribbean islands. So here's a figure from your text. You can see that we use lots and lots of water for agriculture. We got also use some water for industry, and then, there's personal consumption of water as well. Hopefully you're getting your recommended 8-ounce glasses of water per day. I typically don't. I wish coffee counted, but it doesn't. As we are depleting our aquifers, that is going to cause there to be less pressure to support the ground, and that leads to sinkholes forming in many major cities and towns. To conserve water, there are many things that you can do. You can have a natural landscape. And when I say a natural landscape, you can plant species in your landscaping that are not going to be water-intensive species. Petunias are beautiful, but they suck a lot of water up. So instead of planting petunias in your garden, why don't you plant some native prairie grasses or some cacti in your landscaping? Plant native plant species that have water needs that are suited to local rainfall, so you don't need to irrigate. If you do need to irrigate, instead of using an aerial irrigation system, instead focus on a drip irrigation system so that less water is wasted by spraying it into the atmosphere and having it being blown away. And then finally, you should also look at ways to recycle and reuse wastewater. For example, here we have a water treatment plant, and this water treatment plant is processing sewage and is allowing for that sewage to be reused as a source of water for crops. So we could take wastewater that would normally be lost, and we could take that treated sewage and then water our crops with it. Another renewable resource is food, and this is the great conundrum on our planet. Here on our planet, we produce more food than what we, the global population of human beings, can consume. The downside is this food production is not going to be evenly distributed where the food needs to be. There's an excess of food in one area, and then a shortage of food in another area. And because the food distribution networks are so inefficient, we have people dying of starvation on our planet. We typically get our food from growing a crop, raising cattle or animals, or going fishing. Now, there are some farming methods that are harmful. But these are very widespread methods that are very effective in terms of producing large yields. And that is going to be planting only a few genetic varieties. And if we look at farming practices in the United States, traditional farming practices are going to revolve around 5 or less varieties or species of plants being planted very frequently. Those are corn and soy. Corn and soy, particularly corn is king. Then we have soy, we have wheat, and then you can have barley and oats as some less popular plant species that are going to be used. Many times we have a heavy use of fertilizer, and we pretty much maxed out the use of fertilizer, pesticides, and insecticides for increasing crop yield. And then there's also a lot of fuel consumption. Many of these tractors, or how can I say this, many of the machines used for harvesting and planting our food don't necessarily have high fuel efficiency. Your miles per gallon on your John Deere tractor, generally speaking, is not going to be an advertised statistic or something you even care about when you're looking for a tractor. More current farming methods have led to a decrease in soil erosion and degradation and a decrease in salinization. Salinization is a very scary thing. What happens when we put fresh water on the ground is that fresh water, generally speaking, will evaporate. And that all fresh water will contain a very low amount, a very small amount of dissolved salts in it. Not enough to make it salty, but just a very small amount of salt. And as that fresh water evaporates, the salt is left behind. And over the years, as we have more and more fresh water evaporating, more and more salt is left behind, and this leads to a salinization of the ground. If you look at the ancient Middle East, it used to be a much more fertile area around Palestine and Israel, so on, in Iran and Iraq. Now the soil in the ancient Middle East, kind of the breadbasket of humanity, has had so many centuries of irrigation and fresh water evaporating on it that now the soil is much more saline or salty, and it's much more difficult for crops to grow in that soil. There's going to be some controversy over genetically modified or genetically engineered crops. The consensus is right now, genetically modified crops, is that there's been no demonstrated in a peer-reviewed, scientifically accepted study that there are risks or any adverse health effects associated with genetically engineered crops. The downside of genetically engineered crops is the unknown. You just don't know every single variable, and that causes a lot of people to be weary or concerned about genetically engineered crops. I am getting up there in age. I remember before genetically modified corn and soybeans were everywhere. And one of my very first jobs, actually, yes, my very first job, I was in 4th grade when I started this job, was to walk up and down every row in the cornfield, every row in the soybean field, and every row of every field the local farmer owned, and I had to weed the field by hand. It took hours and hours every day over the summer, pulling velvet leaf and mustard weed out of the field. Now, thanks to genetically modified crop species, instead of that farmer paying poor boys local boys like me to weed the field by hand, they instead buy some insecticide and herbicide, spray the field, and they can do the job of a whole classroom of little boys, because I was a little boy back then when I started. Thank goodness there weren't child labor laws. They can have a much more efficient work output. It's much easier and cheaper to spray a field with pesticides and herbicides and insecticides than it is to hire local kids to weed the field by hand for you. If we look at raising livestock, livestock is very energy intensive. It takes a lot of food to raise the livestock, and to generate the food you need to farm the food. One thing that we can do as an individual is to increase our vegetable or plant matter consumption. The carbon footprint of eating a plant is much less than the carbon footprint of eating an animal. Not only are they cheaper, but they are better for the environment, generally speaking. And if we look at a typical Western diet, we have way too much red meat, way too much protein in our typical Westernized diet. Some crop practices right now that are in play that can help reduce the negative impacts of agriculture include polyculture. And when we look at polyculture, this is going to be a phenomenon where you have multiple crop species being planted on the same field. We also have contour farming, where you and actually this is a bad figure for contour farming. A better figure is over here. Not only are they practicing polyculture in the field, they're also practicing contour farming. The farmer is following the contours of the hills to minimize the amount of water loss through erosion. When we look at this figure, not only do they have contour farming, but I think this figure is a better indication of no-till plowing. You can see that there's lots of vegetable matter on the ground, or organic plant debris on the ground. And this plant debris that's on the surface, this roughage that was left on the surface, helps to hold the soil in place. And then finally, instead of relying on herbicides and insecticides, you can rely on biological pest control. And if you live in rural or agricultural area here in the Midwest, you know that Asian beetles, sometimes referred to as Japanese beetles, and a close relative of the ladybug, are, yes, very successful at eating aphids. But when the soybean and corn is harvested in the fall, all of these tens of thousands of millions of beetles invade your country home. A non-renewable resource is something that cannot be regenerated within a typical human lifetime or within a timely fashion. These are going to typically be fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are a great source of concentrated energy. Most of our energy comes from the burning of these fossil fuels. The downside of coal, oil, and natural gas is that burning these fuels is harmful to the environment. It causes a buildup in greenhouse gases, and I should also note, it also causes a buildup of nitrous dioxide and sulfur dioxide gases, which contributes to acid rain. A renewable source of energy is going to be solar, wind, or hydropower. or I should also add, I would be remiss if I didn't mention nuclear. Nuclear is kind of the redheaded stepchild. Yes, nuclear is good for the environment in that it doesn't increase the carbon content of the atmosphere. No, nuclear is bad for the environment because it leaves radioactive waste behind, and it is a non-renewable resource. Something that would be interesting to read up on is how to recycle spent nuclear fuel rods and use them to generate more electricity, which is common practice in France. Why we don't do it in the United States is a little bit beyond me. And as opposed to storing spent fuel rods, we could reduce, recycle, and reuse spent fuel rods to generate more nuclear electricity. Some renewable resources of power are going to include water, wind, solar, and geothermal being the new kid on the block. Iceland is a prime example of a country with lots of volcanic activity that relies very heavily on geothermal energy. We here in the United States don't rely as heavily on geothermal energy. We are going to be big proponents of wind, solar, and hydropower. Ironically, the country on the planet that has the most solar energy production is also the country on the planet that burns the most fossil fuels, and that is China. Wind and solar energy are becoming much more common. Right now, we're at almost the tipping point of solar energy being cheaper than coal energy. And once it's cheaper to get electricity from a solar panel than it is from burning coal, we are going to see an explosion in solar energy. Here we have a picture of a hydroelectric dam. Here we have wind farm. Here we have some solar panels, and these are actually quite dated pictures of solar panels. Solar panel design has progressed tremendously. Just a couple weeks ago, there was announced a new kind of roofing tile that was also a solar panel at the same time, and it came in very attractive brick red, dark blue, and black colorations. Oh, and brown as well. So they almost mimic natural slate tiles, but each individual tile was a solar panel. Thank you, Elon Musk. Some other non-renewable resources include minerals. The mineral content of our Earth, of our planet, is going to be both the fossil fuels and the non-metallic and the metallic elements in our crust. We consume these minerals in our everyday lives as we have products that we make, and then products that we throw away, and then products that we recycle. The consumption of minerals is going to contribute to the amount of hazardous waste in the environment. A good example of this is gold mining. To remove gold or gold particles from sediment, many times there's going to be a cyanide bath used. And while this is quite dangerous, it still is the most effective and the safest method of removing gold from tropical gold mines. As we produce plastics and pesticides and herbicides, as we produce these disposable materials, we have lots of waste being made as a downside. CFCs, or chlorofluorocarbons, are also being produced, and thankfully, within at least developed countries, the amount of CFCs being produced has been dramatically decreased. And that's a good thing, because these chlorofluorocarbons react within the atmosphere to remove ozone molecules from our upper atmosphere to reduce the ozone layer, which is a bad thing, because that ozone layer acts as a blanket or a shield that keeps ultraviolet radiation from getting down to the Earth's surface at very high concentrations. We also find that there are an increase of waste products entering bodies of water, and these waste products can be biologically magnified. There can be biomagnification. If we look at biomagnification, this is going to be, generally speaking, a concentration of a fat-soluble toxin or chemical as we move up trophic levels in the food chain. So if we look at very low trophic levels, there will be just in the environment as a whole, there's an almost minuscule, non-noticeable or measurable concentration of the chemical. And then as we go up the trophic levels, there is a dramatic magnification or concentration of that chemical. DDT used to be a very common pesticide used, and it was found that DDT was being biomagnified within predatory birds, such as the American bald eagle. A big downside of DDT is that it would cause the eggs within from an American bald eagle to be very thin, and when the mother bird would sit on her eggs, she would crush the eggs and kill her offspring before they could be hatched. Another chemical that's commonly biomagnified is methylated mercury in our environment. And you'll oftentimes hear warnings about not eating the salmon or the tuna or the northern pike, these apex predator fish that are oftentimes... Concept check, class. Please indicate which is and which is not a renewable resource. We have coal, corn, iron, clean water, and solar energy. Go ahead and pause this video and get me an answer right now. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Alrighty, class, if we look at which is and which is not a renewable resource, anything that can be regenerated, so coal, corn, clean water, and solar energy are all going to be considered renewable resources. They can be regenerated within a usable time frame. But if we look at coal and iron are non-renewable resources. They cannot be regenerated within a relatively short time period. And that's all we have for this lecture recording. If you have any questions for me about this course material, please feel free to post them on the class discussion board, shoot me an email, or swing by my office when you're on campus. Happy